Hello and welcome back. My name is Ken and this is my philosophy book. Where did it come from? Well, a couple of weeks ago there was a mattress salesman going door to door around my area, so naturally I asked him in. We had a chat, but after we finished I realised he left this book behind and I decided to read it, and it was actually pretty interesting. And I came across a chapter recently called Plato's Cave. So, what is Plato's Cave? Well, unlike many of the other famous caves I'm sure you've heard of, this one actually isn't real. But before we get onto that, I want you to do something. A game, say, or a question. Describe a tree. Just now to yourself, describe a tree. You can do it out loud if you'd like, if that helps. Okay, so you're describing the tree, right? And you're thinking, okay, the brown, made of wood, it's got branches, it's got leaves, and all this kind of stuff. But it's funny because I don't really have to go into that detail if I want to describe a tree to you. Just the word tree, just by saying that word, the image of a tree is put into your head. I just say tree and you just think. You don't necessarily think, oh yes, tree, that's the one with the bark and the branches and the leaves and all that kind of stuff. You just go, ah, tree, yes, I know exactly what you mean. But that's because we've both seen a tree. I've seen a tree, you've seen a tree. But the question I want to ask you now is, describe to yourself a tree so well that someone who has never seen a tree can understand it completely. But don't worry about that too much right now, because we're going to kind of circle back to that in a little bit. But leave it in the back of your head and think away, how would you describe the perfect tree? Okay, so what is the premise behind Plato's Cave? Well, let's take the words from the man himself. He says, "Behold, human beings living in an underground den, like ourselves. They see only their own shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave." It's a bit condensed, if you didn't know what we were talking about, you might not fully get it, but it's a cool quote, so I thought I'd include it. Basically, the idea of Plato's Cave is you have to imagine a cave with people in it. People who have lived in that cave their entire life, born, grew up, and, will eventually die there. And they're tied up, they're restrained in some kind of way where they can't move their arms, they can't move their legs, they can't move their head. The only thing they see in this cave is a wall, right? And behind them is fire. There's some kind of fires lighting up the cave because they're being held prisoner by some people. So these people who are holding the prisoners are moving stuff around behind them, behind the people, but in front of the fires. So if you can imagine the people only staring at the wall, all they can see are the shadows of the things moving past. They can see their own shadows being cast by the fire on the wall, and they can see the shadows of the things being moved past. So if they seen a tree being walked past, they wouldn't see the tree, they would only see the shadow being cast by the fire on the wall. And I think it's interesting that it's a fire, because this will come up later, but obviously, they didn't have LED lights or anything back then. But if you've ever had a fire, it's quite imperfect. It keeps moving, so any kind of shadow coming from that is also going to be moving and changing, and that's kind of the point, is these shadows that we're looking at, the shadows of, say, a still object, like a person who's tied there, is going to be moving, it's going to be changing. So anyway, these people, all they can look at are their shadows, and the shadows of things being passed by. That's the world to them. That's all they know. So when I say tree to them, they don't think of a tree as a brown, woody, bark-covered thing with lots of green leaves. They see a shadow of a tree. They see this black shape of a tree. But to them, they know it. They can recognize it instantly as a tree, because that's all they've ever known. So we get it. We get the premise that these people are in the cave and all they can see are shadows. Then what happens next? Someone is set free inside the cave. So they're cut loose from their restraints and they can move about the cave. They turn around, they see the light source, they see the fire, and they understand. They go, that's where they're starting to come from. They start to understand that the things they were seeing weren't the things, they were shadows. They see the actual objects. They see the trees and people and things that move behind them. One person now, he can see it, but no one else can. And he's trying to tell people, but they have no frame of reference. They can't comprehend what he's telling them. And he's just inside the cave. After that, another guy gets loose. Or maybe it's the same guy. Maybe it's the same guy having a really great day. But anyway, one of the prisoners is let out of the cave and he steps into the real world. And it's not dark, it's not dim, you can see everything. You can see everything in the most vibrant colors. He's seen the shadow of a tree. He's seen a tree in a dark, dim cave. But now he's seen a tree in the sunlight. He sees the bright, vibrant colors. He sees the fruit growing on it. And he understands a tree in a way he never could have before. And after walking around and kind of, getting to know this new world, this new realm, as it were, it's like he stepped into a new plane of existence. He decides, it might be time to go back to the cave. And what happens next? Well, let's just say it's gonna knock your socks off. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So before we find out what this guy did, let's see where we are so far. What's the point of all this? What's the point of the story of the cave? There's a little bit of speculation about, the exact meaning, but generally, the message you kind of would want to take from this is that you cannot fully know something. So this goes back to the tree. Think of the tree. Think of the tree I asked you to describe at the start of this podcast. I wanted you to describe it so articulately that someone who had never seen a tree could understand it without ever having to see one. And you're going to explain it to them, and you think, I know a tree. I've been near trees. Some of my best friends are trees, I climb trees. But can you truly describe to someone the idea of a tree? What is a tree? Can you convey that image of a tree without fully understanding it yourself? Because what Plato is saying is we don't understand trees or apples or flowers or people or anything, because what we see are shadows on the walls of a cave. This may sound similar to the idea of the brain in the vat from the last episode, but they are slightly different, and the way I would see that difference is that the brain in the vat kind of asks, is there a tree? We see the tree, but is the tree even there? In Plato's cave, the tree is there, but can we comprehend it? Can we fully understand what we're looking at? So think about it like this, and we'll stick with the tree, because I guess I just love trees. But when I ask you to describe a tree, and if I were to describe a tree, I'm basing that on 5 main senses: sight, touch, taste, smell, and sound. When you go through like that, you think, what am I missing? You can describe how a tree looks, how it feels, what it smells like, the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, and if you really wanted, you could describe what the tree tastes like, but I wouldn't know that personally. But anyway, so you think, yeah, that kind of covers everything, but it's a little bit crazy when you think of everything that's in the universe, everything that's in the world, and we've boiled it down to 5 things. We're going to describe everything using 5 different methods of observation. It seems so small, it seems so minuscule. Imagine an alien who comes from another place, and they don't have our 5 senses. They don't see, they don't smell, they don't touch, they read gamma waves, and they use echolocation, they do things. They, too, would sense the presence of a tree, but they couldn't know it like we know it. The tree they know is completely different to the tree we know, but it's the same thing. But if you want to look at it in an even more simple way, Plato himself kind of describes the problem, and he talks about how we can't even know it as it is. It's forever changing, like the shadows on the walls of a cave. So he talks about an apple, and he says if you look at an apple at noon, the sun is high in the sky, it's getting all the light, that apple is red. It's a beautiful red shiny apple. But if you look at that same apple at dusk, at sunset, the darker it gets, the apple's not red anymore, it's black. I think the point is there. When you look at an apple, it's not always going to be an apple. I mean, you could describe an apple to an alien or someone who has never seen an apple and say, yes, apples are shiny and red. And then they see an apple at night and they go, no, it's not. So based on this kind of whole apple thing, Plato comes up with this idea, a theory of forms. So what does that mean? Basically, it's that somewhere there is the perfect example of everything. There is the perfect apple that exists, and that apple will always be red, it will always be shiny, it will always be apple-shaped. There's the perfect tree. The perfect tree will always be tall. So this realm of perfect forms is the basis of which all the shadows of our world are cast from. So this perfect tree is there, it exists, it is the example. The trees we see are reflections of that, are shadows of that. always changing, never the same, imperfect. And maybe after hearing that, you kind of think, well, that's not such a bad idea, that's kind of interesting. Maybe there is this perfect place where, there is the perfect square, the perfect circle, the perfect house, the perfect car, and everything we see is based off of that, the reflections and the shadows of that. Or maybe you're the other kind of person who thinks that's a load of crap. What are you talking about? A tree is a tree, you know. Yeah, I get what you're saying. Maybe we don't understand everything. Maybe there's elements of a tree we can't comprehend. But there's no perfect tree. You can't go to tree heaven. There's no realm of trees. And if somehow you have some kind of third opinion on this, then you are probably a very clever person, because ever since Plato put forth this idea of the forms, the perfect forms, there's been kind of two sides to the debate. The universals, which are kind of on Plato's side, and they say redness exists. There is red, and every other red that we have in our kind of earthly existence is a shadow of that. And then there are the nominalists, which say things like red and tallness, colors and descriptions. That's all they are. They're just descriptions. They're just names that we give. There is no redness. We just say apples are red because we want to describe the similarities between different items. So an apple is red, the traffic light is red. They're two different shades, but they're also different. But we do need to describe the similarity between them, so we say they are red. And people have been debating this for the past 2,000 years, still to no avail. So it doesn't really matter which side of the camp you come down on, because I think personally, there's a bit of merit on either side. I think I'd be more inclined to be in the camp that says they're just labels. I don't personally think there is a realm of perfect forms, but it's an interesting concept, and that's philosophy for you. You don't have to take everything, you don't have to accept it, because times change, we learn things that they didn't know back then. Not that we can disprove a realm of perfect forms, but personally, I don't believe it. And you might be asking yourself, what was the point of Plato kind of putting forth this? Well, he was a philosopher, firstly, so he wanted to educate people, enlighten his fellow man, that kind of thing. He was a student of Socrates, so he was big into, asking questions and trying to broaden his horizons and the horizons of those around him. But that's not the whole of it, and I did mention earlier that one of the prisoners from Plato's cave decided to go back to that cave, or at least he thought about it, and he was unsure, kind of naturally at first, because he was in the perfect realm. It's brilliant. It's, walking from hell essentially into heaven. Why would you want to go back? But this person felt he had to tell the others what it was like, what they were missing, essentially. So he decides, you know what, I'm going to go back. So he goes into the cave, and he's so used to the light outside now. He's been outside for so long, his eyes had adjusted to the light that when he goes back into the cave, he can't see. It's so dark, it's so dim, that he's falling all about the place. He's tripping up over himself. But all the people who never left the cave, they're looking at him like, what's this guy doing? He's trying to tell them, look, I know what you see, a tree. And they go, yeah, a tree. And they're thinking of a shadow. He's thinking of the true form. He's thinking of a tree in the sunlight. And he's trying to describe it to them. But they can't comprehend it. They don't understand. Plus, they've seen him stumble in from nowhere. They think he's a madman. They think he's an idiot. And Plato goes on to say that if he insists upon his ideas, he keeps pressing these ideas that he's trying to put on these people, that it may eventually lead to this person being killed, because he's such an outcast now. He can't live in this world after seeing the realm of perfect forms, because he can't explain it to them without them seeing it. They just have to experience it. And because they have no idea, they have no frame of reference, they think he's mad. They think he's a fool. And they think he's someone who needs to be silenced. And this goes back a bit, and it's kind of interesting, because although it is an interesting idea and it does make you think about the kind of things we know and what we take for granted, I think it's a bit of a metaphor, or like an allegory, because the man who goes out of the cave and comes back to inform the others is the philosopher. It is Plato and it is Socrates. It's someone who has seen the next horizon, and they're coming back to share that information. And people around them don't like it. They can't understand it, and it scares them, and they push back against these ideas, which, happened to Socrates. That was Plato's teacher, it was his mentor, and Socrates was insistent upon his philosophical ideas and questioning everything, and people didn't like it. In fact, they didn't like it so much that in the year 399 BC, Socrates was executed. He was killed by the Athenian state because he refused to stop questioning things, because he refused to stop being who he was, being a philosopher and trying to expand the horizons of the people around him. So I think there's a kind of a subtle, well, maybe not so subtle, but a message in the whole kind of story of the cave. The first and foremost message is questioning what we know, and the second message is of tolerance. It's trying to put people in the mindset of Plato. It's trying to get people to understand what it's like to be the person on the other side, the person outside of the cave, because let's face it, the vast majority of us are the ones in the cave. We don't all get to go out, and I'm sure Plato isn't saying don't listen to every crazy person on the side of the street, but just because someone's idea may seem outlandish, it's not a reason to push them away or vilify them. You have to question what we know and maybe take on board a little bit. You can entertain an idea without accepting it. And I think it's asking for that tolerance in this message. And maybe now you're thinking, wow, that was pretty interesting, cool story, but what can I do with this information? How does this affect me personally? And it might not. I think it's up to us to take from the story what we want. I think that's what a lot of philosophers do. They're great. They ask questions, but they don't give instructions. They just say, what if? And then when you say, okay, what if, but then why? They say, well, and they shrug their shoulders, and it's up to you. But I encourage you to find your own meaning, and I'll leave you with this little nugget of a food for thought. Earthly knowledge is but a shadow. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next time.